Good morning, and thanks for joining the webinar, The State of Identity, How Security Teams Are Addressing Risk. My name is Julie Smith, and I'm the Executive Director of the Identity-Defined Security Alliance, and thank you for joining us today. I have a few logistical items before we get started. First, if you have questions for the panel throughout the session, please submit them through the Q&A chat window. We'll hold all questions till the end. We are recording this session, and we'll be sharing the link with those that are unable to make it today, or if you'd like to forward it on to colleagues who might be interested in the content. Lastly, the slides will also be posted after the webinar, always a popular question. Before I turn it over to today's speakers, I wanted to provide a quick introduction to the Identity-Defined Security Alliance. The IDSA is a nonprofit organization that facilitates community collaboration to help organizations reduce risk by providing education, best practices, and resources to implement identity-centric security. Our membership is comprised of leading identity and security vendors, in addition to our customer advisory board members who provide guidance on our mission and represent the practitioner community. We deliver on our mission through cross-vendor collaboration, thought leadership through blogs, webinars, speaking, and sessions such as today, as well as research. An identity-centric security framework, which is essentially a vendor-agnostic set of best practices, security outcomes, and approaches for identity-centric security. Customer implementation stories so that you can learn from those who have gone before you in implementing identity-centric security and identity-centric initiatives such as Zero Trust, and virtual community for sharing experiences and validation. I wanted to let you know that we will be publishing our latest adaptation of the Identity-Defined Security Framework, so look for a blog announcing those changes in the next couple of days. And now on to the webinar. Our presenters today are Diane Hagglund, Principal and Founder of Dimensional Research. Diane has tremendous experience with the technology people and processes of corporate IT teams. She spends her days gathering practical feedback from technology stakeholders to help her clients gain a deeper understanding of the operational and strategic choices that will delight their customers. Her passion is making data approachable, actionable, and even fun, which you'll definitely get a glimpse of today. Joining Diane is Richard Bird. Richard is IDSA Executive Board Member as well as Ping Identity Chief Customer Information Officer. He is a cybersecurity veteran and former Chief Information Security Officer. He is an internationally recognized identity-centric security expert, not just from a security solution standpoint, but as the former global head of identity for JP Morgan Chase's consumer businesses. Diane, at this point, I'll turn it over to you and Richard to discuss the important highlights of our recent survey and a discussion on the results and implications.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Julie, and hello, everyone. It is an absolute pleasure to be here with you today, sharing the results from our recent study investigating some trends with identities and securities. We're going to touch on a few of the key highlights today. There was a lot, so we won't be able to get to everything, but hopefully this will give you a great flavor of some of the important things we uncovered, including what's going on with identities, what's happening with growth, what's driving that. We're going to talk about how corporate security teams are evolving in their perceptions of identities and what they're doing. We're going to dig into that. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what that means organizationally. What are some of the implications to alignment and ownership when it comes to identities in particular? So before we dive into the findings, though, let's make sure we know what it is we're looking at. So the data that I'm sharing with you today is based on an online survey of over 500 IT security professionals. All of the individuals who participated in this study were direct decision makers, either business or technology decisions for their security environments. For those of you who are quickly thinking through your stats 101, what does 511 mean? Let me spare you an exercise and say that that has a confidence interval of plus or minus 4.3% 95% of the time. For those of you who don't remember your stats 101, no worries. Just need to know that this is a very credible research study. Quickly, in terms of those, who were those 511 people, they all came from larger companies. We did require them to work at companies of 1,000 employees or more, including many organizations that were much larger. A mix of job levels, although they did tend towards the more senior levels like executives and managers. A few individual contributors though, architects and other frontline decision makers as well, in a wide range of industries. So with that, let's dive into the good stuff and look at the actual findings. So I want to spend some time, first of all, just talking about what's happening with identities and what's going on. You know, the last 10 years have been such a, it's almost ridiculous to say this to a group like this, but such a time of change, right? It got its own name, digital transformation. The technology has changed so much in the past 10 years. And we wanted to understand what that meant specifically to identities. And so we asked, how have the number of identities changed in your organization in the past 10 years? And the growth that was reported from our security stakeholders was just phenomenal. We found, for example, that over 80%, more than 4 in 5 people are reporting that their identities have at least doubled in the past 10 years. And more than half, 52%, are saying that they grew more than 5-fold, right? So that's for every 100 identities you had 10 years ago, you have 500 identities or more than that today. It's just phenomenal growth. And we see that this growth is particularly aggressive at the largest companies. Among the individuals who worked at companies with more than 10,000 employees, we saw 29%, close to 3 in 10, saying that in the past 10 years, their volume of identities has grown by more than 10 times as much. So we're seeing this just explosive growth that needs to be managed. Now, as soon as you establish that there's growth, I'm sure the question everyone's thinking about is, why? What's driving that? And the first question is a mix of things, right? It's not that just one thing changed and now we have this tremendous growth in identities. We're seeing that this is coming from a wide range of factors. And for anyone who is, you know, going through and saying, hey, that's more than 100%. Yes, it is, because most participants indicated there's multiple drivers of growth in their organization. These can broadly be put into 2 buckets. The first is that there's just more technology, right? So we have things like mobile devices. 76% of individuals are saying mobile devices. We're seeing enterprise connected devices and Internet of Things, cloud applications, you know, all of these things are reporting just tremendous growth. But we're also seeing things like automation, DevOps, managed service providers, containers, and other. On the flip side, we're also seeing drivers just in terms of more employees. Now, interestingly enough, there is just, you know, companies have grown and they have more employees. 57% of people said that. But even more said, not so much more employees, but more employees are using technology. 66% are saying, yeah, we just have, you know, it used to be our knowledge workers and now it's, you know, people on the front line dealing with customers. It's people on the factory floor who have technology. So we're seeing that just the expanse. So all of these things together are driving this tremendous growth. Now, I want to pause for a moment and plug Richard in here because I'm really curious about what he thinks of what we're hearing so far and how that is reflecting what his real world experiences are. Richard, thoughts?
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate the handoff. You know, it's interesting because one of the things that has created a lot of confusion in the marketplace around the explosion of identities is this notion that everything has an identity. And that's a bit misplaced. So when we look at the growth, you know, of identities associated with mobile devices and IoT, enterprise connected devices, the reality is that those devices don't have identities. Those devices are associated with identities. The best example that I can give is that nobody has a problem with their house key as long as they, you know, have it in their hand. If I created 10 copies of your house key and distributed them to, you know, any number of places around, you know, around the community that you live in, you probably feel a whole lot less secure because that's your key, right? It shouldn't belong to anybody else. It's associated to you. You have a relationship with it. And this exponential growth in identities, you know, facilitated through all the different exponential growth categories and technology, still doesn't change the fact that there is a one identity to many devices relationship. And so we need to make sure that we're clear, particularly in workforce, but we need to make sure that we're clear in understanding that while devices have increased, we still are dealing with the same fundamental number of people that we're working with in the workforce. We just have created more access pathways for them in a multi-channel environment to get to applications and data that they need to do their job.
Great, thank you for that, Richard. That's interesting. It all makes tremendous sense in terms of the growth that we're seeing. So let's move now to the next area that we discovered in our research, and that is we wanted to understand, so what's happening to security teams because of these changes? Are their attitudes changing? Are their approaches changing? And we're seeing, yes, as identities grow, we're certainly seeing security teams evolving in some of their opinions around that. We explored this in a couple of ways. First, we asked, how is this changing? And we asked this question to Rays, right? What's happened in the past 5 years? Has the focus changed within the security team? Is it more important? Is it less important? And we found out that, yeah, it's more important. 94% are saying, yeah, in the past 5 years, this became more important to our security team, including more than half, 54%, that characterize that as much more important to the team, right? But if you look moving forward into the future and think about the next 5 years, we don't see that this is going to change. We're continuing to see an evolution where identities continue to become much more important to security teams. So this isn't a one-time blip where, hey, we focused on it and now it's more important. This has changed tremendously in the last 5 years, and it's going to keep changing moving forward. So this is kind of security teams. We also wanted to drill down a little bit in terms of what's happening to the individuals. And so we're curious just how much the individuals who participated in our study are thinking more about identity and access management. And we found that they do. 87% agree with the statement that inadequate identity and access management tools and practices puts the entire security program at risk. And so we see that the individuals are understanding, responsible for security, understand that this isn't a separate thing independent than what they're working on already. It's all together and integrated. We also see, if you look at leadership, that leadership is changing. And we see a remarkable 92% of security decision makers saying that their leadership cares more about IAM today than they've ever have before. So at every level, whether it's the individual level, the team level, or the leadership level, we're seeing security teams indicating that IAM has become much more important to their organizations. So given this, it's unsurprising that when you asked about the security risks that are introduced when a company doesn't focus on good identity and access management practices, the security teams agree. In fact, 100%, every single individual in this study agree that there are security risks. 80% saying there's a bigger risk of a severe breach, 72% saying that they can, quickly detect a data breach, and also some people saying things like, hey, we might even lose business as a result of not having these strong workforce identity and access management practices overall. So, Richard, I want to pause for a moment and pass to you again. You have such great insights. How is this being reflected, day to day among the teams you're working with? Are you seeing these changes?
Yeah, I'm always fascinated when we see survey results, because a lot of times it isn't the folks that are in favor are all saying aye. It's the folks that are maybe saying no. So when we looked at that statistic that came up about inadequate identity and access management tools and practices put our entire security program at risk, I dig the fact that we've got 87% of folks in the survey going, absolutely, I worry about the 13%. What exactly is it that the 13% sees that we don't see collectively in the identity practitioner space? Because when we look at that stat about a greater risk of severe breach, there's a really interesting correlation here. We know that year on year, as published specifically by Gartner, but also published by within the Verizon Data Breach Report every single year. We know that the listed category of breaches and exploits that are facilitated through identity control is somewhere between 80 to 85%. It's interesting that it matches the 80% that we see here on the greater risk of severe breach from people that are familiar with identity, because it suggests that 80% of the world realizes, or 80% of the folks that are engaged in making things secure realize that identity is a core foundational component. Unfortunately, it's also a suggestion that in that 13% that say identity isn't a problem, we've got a massive error rate in that remaining percentage of organizations or practitioners or security professionals who don't really see it as an important issue. And I think that that's challenging, because I've always taken exception to those reports that say 80% of breaches are facilitated through usurped credentials or whatever. Because the last thing that I checked in my entire technology career was that you couldn't get into any system without an account of some kind. So how the other 20% isn't facilitated by usurped credentials, haven't quite figured that out yet. But the reality is that the bad guys have obviously figured out identity is important. When we go further on in the presentation and we see how social engineering of phishing is being successful, and that's because they're focusing on the human element and the identity. And in the meantime, we still have 13% of folks in this survey that don't see identity as the core. So these are the challenges that we will continue to work through over the next 10 years, as we've worked over in the last 20.
Yeah, Richard, that's such great insight. And certainly we can see the efforts of people like yourself to help work on that last 13% who needs some education overall. That's great. So the next thing I want to talk about, and I think this comes up every time, as soon as you think about something overall, like, there are identity related risks, I think the next obvious question is, so what specifically are you worried about? And sometimes if you follow, security trends perhaps through the press, you can get a feeling that there's kind of fads in security. A couple of years ago, it was viruses, and then it was ransomware, and then it was, so we sort of wanted to understand, is there kind of one thing that matters now, or are there a bunch of things? And we saw people reported a mix. They're concerned about a lot of things, with phishing at 83% topping the list, followed by social engineering at 70%, and a wide range of other things. So Richard, again, I want to ask, do you think people are spending their time in the right places?
Well, that's a great question, because when we look at this, and it's fun to see the list of attendees on this webinar, because I see old friends and colleagues here listed, and many of them have gone through this experience where the biggest fight that we used to have in access administration versus access control was the one that's still at 44%, the post-it note password management. That's been a problem that has been evident for 20 years. But when we look at what's really pushing response, reaction, and frankly crisis within identity, it's this rise of phishing, social engineering, and the abilities to access privileged capabilities and entitlements that have really manifested over the last, within the window of the last 3 to 4 years. And, I'll fall back to what I had said earlier, which is for anybody in the marketplace that does not understand the value and the necessity of identity control, and I'm differentiating from identity, access management back in the post-it note days, there's a major disconnect in really acknowledging that the bad actors are going after individuals to be able to get a hold of their credentials, to be able to be them inside of your companies. The bad guys have figured out that identity is everything. And if we're still laboring to convince people that identity is even important, let alone critical, it makes the fight sometimes challenging, sometimes exhausting. But I will say, for those folks that are on the call, stay in the fight, because the amount of progress that's been made in the time that I've been a practitioner is astounding. And I do think that the numbers that are in the survey are suggesting that there are changes in attitudes and changes in expectations relative to identity.
Great, fascinating, fascinating. Perfect. So the next thing that we wanted to look at in our research was, okay, now we've established that security thinks this is important and that they're concerned about the risk. What do they think about their ability to deal with that risk? And so we asked how they would characterize their team's awareness and understanding of the organization's identity strategy. If you don't understand the strategy, how can you secure your identities? And I want to say that one of the things always to keep in mind when you're doing this kind of research is that people do tend to be biased in favor of their own capabilities, right? And so you ask people to give themselves a ranking or a scoring, they tend to err on the high side. And so for me, when I saw these numbers come in and we see that only a quarter are there in that green pie giving themselves excellent marks, I found this to be a little bit worrisome, that even the security teams are saying, you know what, we need to work on this. We can do a better job. So Richard, I'm going to go back to you. Am I right to be concerned?
Yeah, I think so. And it's interesting that in this excellent category, I feel in terms of the survey results, there are other correlations that, suggest that while we've made substantial progress, because I will say that, if we go back 5 years, the non-existent or limited category would have been substantially larger than it is currently in these survey results. But this correlation of excellent, where we're at relative to security teams' awareness and understanding of identity and an organization's strategy is obviously not far enough along to make the world as safe as it should be. The okay but could do better in the 66% is extremely troubling, because the reality is that within identity control, and I'm going to visit on this in just a little bit as we get further along in the presentation, but the identity control space has been recognized as a component of control for security frameworks for now several years, decades, whether it's NIST CSF or it's ISO or it's Gartner Carta, all of them recognize identity as a critical security foundation, and yet it is still unclear within organizations how identity ties into the overall security strategy. So when we look at that on a scale of 66% of okay but could do better, it's fascinating that if we recognize that one bad patch in my vulnerability management organization, or one missed patch, is enough to bring down my company, but we don't, and we attack that problem with urgency, but we don't recognize that one bad identity in my organization represents the same risk because it's not part of my overall roadmap and strategy for security control, uplift, and improvement. We can see why bad things continue to happen relative to cybercrime losses and security consequences.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I really like that focus on that, okay, but could be better, right? Because there might also be a little bit of, hey, we're doing okay, that is a bit hidden in the results here. Fascinating, interesting. Perfect. So I think one of the things that is so interesting, and at Dimensional Research, we have a focus on enterprise technologies. We work with, exclusively with companies who are dealing with technology, and we spend a lot of time thinking about the nuts and bolts of the technology itself. What are the capabilities? What can they do? What can't we do? How does it work? How does it plug together? And what always fascinates me is when you get outside of technology, are there other factors that are actually impacting the decisions and the ability to do a great job? One thing that really struck me in this research is how it's organizational issues who are having a lot of impact on the ability of security teams to fully engage with their identity and identity strategies. And so, for example, if we look at this, we see that, a third are reporting that, yeah, our goals and motivations of our security team and our IAM team, they're not the same, and that's creating issues. We see that just the reporting structure itself creates barriers to collaborate and do a great job. And, to me, it's very striking that we had 30% of people saying that if you look at historically, security hasn't been involved with identities. And it's slow to change when you have that kind of momentum in your organization. So, Richard, again, I love hearing your perspective on this. Are you seeing some of these organizational issues having a direct result on security outcomes?
Yeah, I think there's so many threads to pull on this particular set of results. I think the one that I'd like to hone in on, because I think it ties so well to the previous slide, is the security doesn't understand the responsibilities and terminology of IAM. And there's so much truth to that. Those of us that have been around for a long time, working within the identity practitioner space, know that one of our greatest frustrations is a lack of standards, a lack of common terminology and language. It's almost you could almost suggest that if you got a room of identity practitioners together and through a pair of terms out, authentication and authorization, you're going to get multiple different definitions from a group of practitioners. And I do think that that's important to call out here, because when we reel back to that 66%, okay but not sure, I think that the reality is that the lack of standards, the lack of definition, the lack of a lexicon has been one of the hardest challenges for us to overcome within the trade. And that's really why IDSA is so important, because and there are other organizations that have risen in the last several years that are focused on the idea of creating a standard body of knowledge, a standard body of understanding, a standard body of understanding, as well as language that allows us to be able to communicate with our other security control practitioners in a way that everybody can understand. But like I said, there's so many different things on this slide that catch my attention. The very first one, the goals, motivations, security teams, and IAM teams are not aligned. We do tend to forget, because those of us that have gotten into security, and I, again, I'm looking at the long list of folks that are on this call. Those of us that have gotten into security, we're a particularly interesting breed of people. We want to solve problems. We want to make things safe. We want to have an impact in a positive way. But that does not negate the fact that we all work in companies, and there are all sorts of corporate politics and managerial expectations and influences. There are all these human factors that we need to get through. So, we have to keep in mind that things like, a lot of discussion about identity, and we go back to earlier slides where, my executives or leadership are extremely interested in identity now. We have to remember that comes at a cost of attention being paid to other security controls. I'm not suggesting that's right, wrong, or different. I'm just saying that, when we start to change where money, time, attention is being directed to, we start to see the realities of organizational behavior and dynamics, or corporate politics, if you choose to call it that. And that is manifesting in our teams as we're trying to all learn how to work together, and as we're working through these realities on the identity side of the control spectrum, that we are short and sorely lacking in definitional standards. And again, I'd suggest that this is why the IDSA represents such an important component of the overall effort at this point.
Yeah, Richard, I think that makes so much sense. And when I look at these organizational issues, sometimes it's like you look at this and it's like, yeah, you don't just take a class to solve these problems, right? There's some fundamental cultural issues here that need to be addressed. I do appreciate that you mentioned, though, some of the other factors like budget. We also asked about budget in our survey, and what's happening in terms of spending? Why aren't you doing more about this problem that you've all identified as a big security security risk. And it's fascinating to me, given the conversation we just had, that the top two things were related to organization. You see 40% saying that security and identity budgets are spread across departments, and that, you know, makes it difficult to be really smart about how you spend the money. And some directly say, 30%, that organizational structure is a barrier to adequate spending. So, I mean, are you seeing that organizational and budget as well, Richard?
Without a doubt. And at this point, I mean, I'll sound a little bit more stern on this topic. One of the benefits of my experience, and again, I recognize some folks that have some shared common experience on the webinar audience today, is that I'm old enough and been fighting battles long enough that I go back to the days of having been a director or a head of information security and risk before we got smart and realized that was kind of a segregation of duties problem or a conflict of interest problem. But having had the opportunity to be both a risk practitioner as well as a security practitioner, what I find particularly fascinating about security and identity budgets are spread across departments, or the other category that pops up at 30%, we have other priorities. I find that really interesting from a risk standpoint, because the truth of the matter is that if a company decides it has other budgetary priorities relative to security, because they are operating from a limited pot of available funds, the risk of breach or exploit for what they didn't fix doesn't wait another year until the next budgetary cycle comes along. So if you didn't pay for it today, I can almost guarantee you that you run a higher risk of paying for it tomorrow when things go bad. And it's frustrating because this is a point where all security controls, all security practitioners can really come together relative to helping their companies understand their risk exposures and their potential problems, because the reality is, and I've said this in multiple stages, the reality is regardless of how many companies complain about how much they spend on information security, the continuing cybercrime losses doubling between 2015 and 2021 to nearly $6 trillion suggest that if you keep not spending money because you don't feel like you have the budget for it, the risk doesn't go away and the consequences are still going to be really, really bad. And the hope here is that as we're seeing more and more attention paid to identity, and for all of my multi-control practitioners that are on the discussion, you know, have hope. The hope here is that as we increase our capabilities around identity control and the ability to prove that you are who you say you are and you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, and you have what you're supposed to have, we will be able to make it better for all the other security control areas relative to them being able to do their jobs effectively with the budgets that they've been allocated. Because if we get identity right, we don't have to have massive amounts of additional technology for overlapping controls to simply keep us safe from the fact that we can't confirm that somebody is who they say they are within our enterprise.
Yeah, definitely. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great. So changing gears for a moment here, and I want to, one of the things, we've talked a lot about organization and leadership. It's one of the things we wanted to understand is what is happening in terms of ownership and leadership with identities. What role is security playing today, and what does that mean? And I'm wondering if anyone in this call is thinking, I wonder if my organization is normal. I want to say that you probably are, because there just is no standard. Unless you work at one of the very, very, very minor number of companies where security is not involved with IAMs. And probably if that's true, you're not on this call, right? Those people probably have a different set of issues. But aside from that, there is a good chunk of companies that are just really all over the place in terms of their leadership. So we see at the two extremes, right? We have a bunch of people where security does have ownership of IAM. 15% of the security stakeholders, describe themselves as that. We also see, on the other hand, we have 15% saying, sometimes they check in with us once in a while, they consult us a bit. So that's actually not the most common, but fairly normal. We do see that a lot of times security is sharing ownership with another team. 38% are reporting that, where 29% are saying that, you know, they're an influencer and we do have a little bit more to say, but we don't have direct ownership. So it's really all over the place. And Richard, we've seen throughout this data, and I like how you've highlighted this in our conversation, that this is really something that is in flux right now. And I wanted to know, do you feel like this ownership and leadership question is something that's changing and that we'll probably see move in one direction or another? Or do you think this is just the way it is?
Well, it is, I need to really pause for a second, because I have to say that of all of the results that came back, if there's anything that pushes me towards the border of being somewhat emotional, it's this particular set of results. And the reason is because I had certainly hoped professionally that we collectively within the security trades and technology trades had moved the needle much further along in the understanding of the need for leadership within, not just within IAM itself, but as a critical component of the overall security program. And when I see things like, you know, security is an influencer but does not have direct ownership, I'm floored by this, because when you know, I'll go back to you know, the known cybersecurity frameworks. It's really incredible that we could have defined control expectations in you know, well-regarded resources in the forms of NIST and ISO, and yet we still have companies that are not addressing identity as a core security function. You know, we look at these percentages, and that's really interesting to me, because just as a you know, an example, can anybody on the call imagine a situation where threat and vulnerability management didn't report into security, or security was only an influencer, right? Endpoint security wasn't a leader on endpoint security. They just only consulted on it and maybe gave people advice. You know, database monitoring. You go down the entire laundry list of security controls, and only identity is coming up in conversations relative to where does the function belong. Now, is it always going to be this way? No, absolutely not. I think that the unfortunate reality here is that, and many companies have been on this journey for the last 3 or 4 years, where we've seen the rise and changes in overall leadership structures as it relates to identity's place at the table within security programs, as well as identity's place at the table within data privacy programs and a number of other different dimensions, where we have seen big changes relative to, you know, where security is taking a leadership role within identity, is where there have been catastrophic consequences. And that's unfortunate, right? You'd think that we would all be collectively further along in this game, where we can learn from other people's lessons as opposed to learning from us being breached and exploited. But the news cycle, as well as cybercrime losses, do not suggest that we're propagating enough knowledge within companies to help them understand that they need to move in regard to identity faster if they want to mitigate risks and consequences relative to breaches and exploits. But it will change. It will continue to change currently under hardships faced by companies as they continue to get breached or exploited within the 80% category of usurped credentials and accounts and identities. But like I said, a bit disappointed that we haven't seen a bigger change in this space relative to expectations for identity within security programs and with a seat at the table.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Richard, thank you so much for all your insights. I think we've gotten to the end of what we were hoping to share with you today. Yeah, I will emphasize that there was a lot to this research report. We didn't have time to go into all of it on the webinar today. I know that Julie at the end is going to point you to the report itself if you're interested in understanding more about what we did or some of our other findings. But I hope that we've been able to talk about the fact that there is a really explosive growth in identities driven by a wide range of factors, especially especially technologies. We've talked about how important identities are to corporate security, both the individual, the team, and leadership level within those organizations. And I think Richard's been so eloquent on, some of the lack of alignment that is occurring there and lack of ownership and some of the consequences of that. So for today, I think we will leave it at that. Richard, I'll pass it to you for any last thoughts, and then we'll go back to Julie for Q&A.
Well, again, I know I got a little bit serious as we got to the last set of survey results, but I guess my feelings in wrapping this up are, emphasizing the change that I've seen in my working career within identity, and that change includes organizations like IDSA, being created, standing up, growing, expanding. I mean, if you were on at the earliest part of the call, for those that are in the audience, you saw the laundry list of organizations that are coming together. And if you look at that list closely, you'll know that a number of the organizations on that list are typically more competitive in the marketplace against each other. But we recognize how critically important moving the needle, moving the dials, increasing capabilities around identity are to the degree that we have to come together, we have to collaborate on more than just technical standards. We have to collaborate on terminologies, on use case standardization, all those different pieces. And I would just share with this audience that that is such a huge change from when I first started, working in this trade, when I was just, trying to keep everything together and keep things from blowing up. Because there were embedded credentials or bad directories or whatever the case might be. There's been such a big change and uplift. We do have a long way to go, but we have really made progress, and that's what I would share with everybody.
Great, thanks, Richard. This is Julie again. Just a reminder to enter your questions in the Q&A window. If you have any questions you'd like to ask Diane and Richard. I did have one that wanted to ask you, Diane, from a security researcher perspective and other surveys you've conducted, was there anything particularly surprising about these results?
Oh, that's a good question. So I'm going to say, and I touched on this a little bit when we were talking, but probably the data that struck me the most looking at this was the low number of people, that only 24% that said they had an excellent awareness of their IAM strategies. It's one of these things that really does, researchers spend a lot of time thinking about is that people are self-reporting, right, their opinions, and people tend to really think they're doing better than they actually are. One of the pieces of data that I think comes up consistently is that 80% of people believe they're in the top 20% of performers among employees at their company. And I'm sure everyone in this audience can understand the impossibility of that data. And, so for me to have this audience that are, admitting they might not be as good as they could be is so interesting. And, I think is a sign probably of the reality of this problem and the opportunity to do better, because, admitting you have a problem is the first step.
Great, thank you. So Richard, question for you. In your experience, is the growth we've experienced in the last 5 years what you would have predicted? Do you think we are underestimating where we are headed?
Oh, so it's really interesting that I would say that the growth of the last 5 years has been somewhat disappointing, but the growth of the last 2 has been the exact opposite. So I feel like there was a lot of effort that was going on, 5 years out, that was, so oriented towards putting into effect all of the different learnings and changes that everybody had, kind of accumulated, domain bridging, all the bad habits. We just finally got into a place where we were starting to make improvements. And then we began to deal with extremely complicated issues within cloud applications and within new infrastructure and application deployment patterns and methodologies. And then we kind of went on, I feel like, pause. But in the last 2 years, what I find is really interesting has been, as we talk about IDSA, has been, this realization that we have got to get a larger amount of focus on identity. And now that has started to propagate into, really all corners of the world, but certainly all corners of the United States, as we're seeing big changes relative to conversations on identity, unique identities or unique authenticators for everything from citizens to consumers to workforce. There's just big shifts that are going on. What concerns me is that we kind of go back to that metric that I saw before. What concerns me is that we still have a certain percentage of the business world that we're arguing the importance of identity with. And in the meantime, identity is advancing rapidly into so many different sectors and flavors and variations and technological innovations that it is problematic that we're still trying to convince some people that it's an important topic.
Thanks, Richard. One question specifically about the demographics of the survey. Was it conducted only in the US, Diane?
Yes, this was a US study. For those of you who are interested in this kind of level of detail, that meant that the individuals that we surveyed were based in the US. Many of them did work for companies, that operated internationally. They physically were located in the US. And I will say that in our experience, certainly, we would not want to blindly extend this to the rest of the world, but usually with studies like this, we don't find tremendous differences internationally. And so I would expect, just given our usual, when we do international studies and do that analysis, I would expect this would certainly be fairly indicative of the rest of the world. But I would emphasize this particular study was US only. Great,
thanks. Looks like going once, going twice, going 3 times. Don't have any additional questions. So I did want to say thanks to Richard and Diane. That was an awesome discussion and appreciate your time today and your contributions to the IDSA. Before we sign off, I wanted to point you, as Diane mentioned, to a couple of resources, backup and additional material, if you will, for the content that was discussed today. There's a blog that was posted on December 9th that goes into I guess it's more of a summary of the survey itself that also has a link to the full research report. So if you want to hit our website to get more information, check those out. And then lastly, I know a lot of folks in the security and identity space are attending RSA next week. If you're there and available on Tuesday afternoon, we'll hope you join us for a security leader panel. You can see we've collected a group of illustrious leaders, and we'll be having a great discussion on whether the future of security is identity-centric. If you hit our website, you'll see a link at the top of the page to register. Thanks again to everyone for joining us today. As mentioned, you'll receive a link to the webinar recording that you can share with your colleagues, and I'll also be posting the slides themselves. And lastly, we hope that you will join us in our mission of bringing identity and security closer together. Thanks again and have a great day.